All right, good evening. My name is Leah Rauch. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Education here at Illinois Holocaust Museum. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, our Board of Directors, volunteers, staff, and community partners, I would like to thank you all for joining us tonight, virtually and in person, for a film screening and discussion on Passage to Sweden. Passage to Sweden, a documentary produced and directed by Suzannah Warlick, tells a compelling story about European Jews who escaped to freedom and safety in Sweden and events that occurred in Scandinavia and Budapest during World War II. The documentary highlights ordinary people's courageous acts that helped save thousands of Jews from the occupying German forces. At risk of their own lives, these individuals defied the occupation with spontaneous and dramatic rescue operations as a powerful example of how anyone can make a difference, even during the darkest of times. We will now follow up with the moderated discussion led by Rick Salomon, the Vice President of Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center's Board of Directors. Daughter of the legendary Scandinavian Rabbi J. I. Zuber, Chana Sharfstein is a renowned author, educator, lecturer, and tour guide. Chana is a retired member of the Board of Education of New York City and is a docent at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Suzannah Warlick is the owner of Bubble Soup Productions. She films, edits, and produces on a freelance basis. She is truly an independent filmmaker from start to finish and wears many different hats in the making of and distributing her own films. Her previous documentaries include The Queen's Court, Supporting Actors, and Match and Marry. Howard Veisz, who after a 35-year litigation career and a 2-year sea voyage, became deeply involved in the preservation of historic vessels at Connecticut's Mystic Seaport Museum, which led to Veisz writing the book Henny and Her Boat, Righteousness and Resistance in Nazi-Occupied Denmark. Moderating our panel remotely is Rick Salomon, Vice President of Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center's Board of Directors. Welcome, everyone, and I'll turn it over to you, Rick.
Thank you very much, Leah. Thank you, Rahim, and the entire IT team. This is a technologically complex event because we not only have a hybrid program, but we also have a moderator remotely. So thank you. First, I want to commend Susanna for the wonderful film. Rescuers is close to my own heart. My own father of blessed memory was saved by a Japanese diplomat stationed in Lithuania, Takuna Sugahara. But who are these points of light in a sea of darkness who dared to do what was right when the rest of the world remained silent? We have much to unpack today with regard to the Danish rescue, the role of Sweden, the wonderful upstander Raoul Wallenberg, the Norwegian rescue, and also, as it ended in the film, the Swedish white buses. So Susanna, as the director of the film, tell us a two-part question. How did you come to pursue this project, and what element was the most compelling to you?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, this woman was the inspiration to making the film, Chana Sharfstein. Chana was in my previous documentary, Match and Marry, and shortly after I interviewed her, she contacted me and said, Susanna, you have to make a documentary about what happened in Scandinavia to the Jewish people and the history about it. And quite honestly, I don't consider myself a historian. And I thought, okay. But what piqued my interest was that here was Chana, an Orthodox Jewish child living in the middle of Europe during World War II, and she had a normal childhood. She wasn't, exposed to any of the horrors that the Jews were exposed to in just neighboring countries. Well, that piqued my interest, but I wasn't so convinced. I was working in an office, and my boss, Mark Jordan, who is listed as the executive producer on here, I told him, Chana wants me to go and make this documentary. I don't know if I want to do it. He whips out his checkbook and he says, just go make your next film. And he gave me enough money to go off to Scandinavia. So at that point, I thought, the stars are aligned. I have to do it. So off we went, and 130 hours of footage later, here we are. But but it, the whole movie was poignant to me only because of the fact that, to be quite honest, I really didn't know anything about the history of Scandinavia. I knew the Holocaust in generalities, of course. I'm the daughter of a survivor, but I really didn't get into the weeds, and I didn't really know the ins and outs, especially of Scandinavia. You hear mostly about Poland, France, um, but you really don't hear about Scandinavia. And as I'm going around with the film, I'm finding that a lot of people don't know the story of what happened to the Jews in Scandinavia. And even people of Scandinavian descent, they're not aware of the history. So, everything. But if you want to ask me one thing that really struck me, well, two things. The Raoul Wallenberg story was amazing, but the Danish story was, oh my gosh, we were traveling around in buses and trains, and Hannah's very good at going up to people and talking to them. And we were talking about the Danish rescue, and more than a handful of people all said the same thing. It was just the right thing to do. It was just the right thing to do, and that like struck me. That was the biggest inspiration that I got from that, because a whole country, a whole nation saving its Jews, doing it, they had nothing to gain from it. They were just being good neighbors and good citizens. That's the long answer to your short question.
No, that's well said. Absolutely. Let me turn to you, Hannah. We have so much to learn from you. So if you would set the scene and give us a little of the background, as your father was as Leah indicated, the chief rabbi of the Orthodox community in Sweden, of the high holidays in 1943. You had a German diplomat, George Duckwitz, who was in Copenhagen and spoke to the rabbis. Give us a little of the background and how it came to be that so many Danish Jews ended up going to the north to fishing villages.
Well, I think that Suzannah really did a great job showing it in the film. And it was just an incredible experience. But really, the basis of the whole thing is the leadership of the country. When you have a leader who has humanitarian feelings and who cares about his people, and King Christian X was an outstanding leader, he never even put on the Jewish star. He treated the Jews just like everybody else, just like the ordinary citizens, and he didn't differentiate. So that really triggered the entire country in Denmark that they should go along with him, because you follow with what the leader says. If the leader is a person who is compassionate and caring, he's the one that gets people going. And I had lots of friends that came from Copenhagen that came to Sweden eventually. And they said that they felt so safe and comfortable because the king made a point of going on his horse through the streets in Copenhagen on a daily basis. And they could see him. He didn't have a bodyguard. He said, I don't need a bodyguard. Danish people are my bodyguard. But I think it was really displayed very much in the film how this George Douglas, they were very smart. The Germans got the message from King Christian X and the mood of the Danish people. And he knew that if they were going to start to take all these people and put them away and take them to concentration camp, the Danish people were going to rebel as a whole because they were going to stand up. These are our citizens. These are our brothers and sisters. We're not going to stand for it. And so the announcement was made by Rabbi Melchior when they went to the synagogue. And you saw that synagogue that was built in 1830. So Denmark was actually the first of the Scandinavian countries that had Jews living there, way before they came to Sweden and Norway and Finland. So it was a whole different story there. They were very well accepted and everything. And the people it was so well organized. The people in the underground, they really appreciated the fact that they could do something against the Germans, and they were really happy to help the Jewish people. But to me, the whole wonder of the whole thing, it was the leadership of the country. And the leadership of the country, was not that they sent the people away to Sweden, but that they brought them back in and that they welcomed them when they came back. That to me was the miracle. That was the thing, that they came back and they were happy to have them back and they greeted them with the greatest warmth. And I also must add that Sweden was not so anxious in the beginning to have them come because Sweden was a neutral country and they were a little bit afraid of shaking the boat and saying, why don't you just come in? So there were a couple of people that were actively involved in getting King Gustavus V, who was my king at the time, to get him to change his mind. And I think it was so interesting that one of the people who convinced him was Greta Garbo, the film star. And she just found it that it was politically, it was just not the right thing to do. And so she actually, because she was very powerful already, she was a very famous film star, contacted King Gustavus V and said to him that you really have to let the Jewish people come into Sweden. It's not right. And she had that kind of attitude and that went along with it. And she also had a producer who was a Finnish Jew and he was with her. His name was Maurice Stiller. And they were powerful with that. And then Niels Bohr, he was in Denmark and he was the one who was very much involved in atomic energy and all the exploration. That he got the Nobel Prize for the work that he did. And he was Jewish, his mother was Jewish. And he actually said, I am not going to follow along with you what you did unless you let the Jews out of the country to go to Sweden. I'm going to go wherever I want and I'll do whatever I want. And of course, nobody wanted to hear him say that because he had all the secrets of the atomic energy. So the king said, okay, we'll let the Jews come out. So it was actually the activities of the Swedish people to allow the Danish people to come in. So that was a big part of it.
That's a remarkable story. Let me turn, if I may, to you, Howard. You have made a second career of not only refurbishing a wonderful Danish rescue boat that my wife and I have had the privilege of seeing in Mystic, Connecticut. But why don't you have a PowerPoint, set the scene a little for us on the Danish rescue in terms of the passage across to Sweden that Hannah just spoke about.
Sure, just set the scene for a moment. I think there's something tremendously revealing as you look at the wall, the entrance to this museum with its plaques to the righteous, and fittingly, plaque after plaque recognizes heroic individuals who rose from the populations among them, from seas of indifference and sometimes complicity, to perform individual acts of decency and heroism. And then there's the plaque for Denmark, which simply says the Danish people, which is how they wanted it, and which is fitting because it took concerted action by the Danish people as a whole to first protect the Jews within Denmark from the intrusion of any form of Nazi persecution for 3.5 years of occupation, while Jews suffered greatly everywhere else. And then the concerted action of the Danish people to go into action to rescue the Jews when all of this was coming tumbling down. And when they found out with 72 hours of notice that the Nazis intended to capture the country's entire Jewish population over a single night, a Friday night, early in the High Holy Days, put them on 2 troop ships and send them off to concentration camps. 72 hours to give everybody warning, to find temporary shelter for them, and to begin a massive maritime evacuation from Denmark to unoccupied Sweden. An extraordinary thing to accomplish, particularly when days earlier, few would have thought it necessary or possible. Over the last 8 years, I've spent considerable time on board one of those rescue boats, one that we're fortunate to have in the U.S., one of only 3 that are still afloat out of the estimated 300 boats that took part in the operation. It's a boat that owes its existence today to the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, which by fortunate coincidence sent a delegation to Denmark to try to obtain a rescue boat while their museum was on the drawing board at a time when the boat that's here now, Gerda 3, was being retired from its role for the lighthouse and buoy service, for which for 60 years it made daily trips in Danish waters to supply a lighthouse and maintain navigation aids, a job that provided a wonderful cover story for the rescue to come. The boat was gifted to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, which restored it in Denmark to exactly what it had been during World War II, and brought it to the US, where since its arrival in '97, Mystic Seaport Museum has cared for, preserved, and displayed the boat on behalf of the Museum of Jewish Heritage. The boat,
You want to take us through your PowerPoint a little of?
Yep, the boat, which we'll turn to now, is both representative in some ways, very similar to other boats that partook in the rescue, and in other ways exceptional. You have the boat there in conditions that were typical of the rescue, generally rough, gale or male gale conditions in the early days in its home waters in Denmark. And here, in its World War II configuration, picture several months before the rescue. And then as it exists today at Mystic Seaport, very much as it did then. And here, the cargo hold, where most of the people being evacuated on Gerda 3 were hidden. There was a space 4.5 feet high at the center. Most of the people, all of the people in that spot, will have been in the boat, their backs pressed against the outer walls, the center of the cargo area filled with actual cargo, barrels of oil, other supplies to the lighthouse. It's a boat for which we're able to ascertain stories of the rescuers themselves. A key person in this operation was young Henny Sindig, who was 22 at the start of the rescue, an employee of the lighthouse and buoy service, and of great importance, leading to her ability to be so helpful. Her father was a Danish Navy officer who had the service and this boat within his command. Before the rescue, she did as Danes were instructed to do by their king, to try to live their lives as normally as possible, to survive in an icy coexistence with the occupation. But with the Nazi assault, the attempt to round up the Jews, she was thrust in a very different direction, throwing herself first into the rescue and then into the armed resistance. And ultimately, after she herself had to be evacuated to save her life, into the Danish brigade, an army in exile in Sweden who was training for a hoped-for invasion of Denmark, a possible D-Day landing on Danish shores. It was the crew of Gerda 3 that initiated its effort. They came to Henny and told her, we have destinations that we've decided would work. We have routes that we've mapped out, but we need you to help us put this into action. We need at least tacit approval from your father to put all of us and the boat at risk. We need you to reposition the boat, which was then at the Royal Dockyard, surrounded by German warships, to a place where we could put people on board. We need you to go out and make contact. Find out, how do you make contact? Now that we have this apparatus, how do we let people know it's there for them? And we need you to help bring people to the boat. She threw herself into this completely. She repositioned the boat behind a warehouse that sits across the harbor from the main part of Copenhagen. And there you can see where it was docked. She arranged with the owners to keep people, as many as they could fit on board for each crossing in the attic space. She found people willing to use their private homes as safe houses where people could wait for 3, 4, 5 days till they could take the final steps to the attic and up to the boat. And for the last part, how to make contact, how to bring people towards us, she made contact and became part of a student resistance group, active until then in the underground press, 7 people at its core, with a leader named Jürgen Keeler, who became the wide end of the funnel. Perfect partners. As medical students, they had ties to a large hospital complex in Copenhagen that spread the word to Jews throughout the city and beyond. You could reach our hospital, we'll hide you here while we work on linking you with boats and then even transport you towards the boats in our ambulances and other vehicles. And as members of the underground press, they were tied to a bookstore That was first within Copenhagen. It was first a center for the press, and then for organizing rescues, and then armed resistance. Each day during the rescue, she would start her day being given a list of rendezvous places for that day, where she would meet one or two people, often an adult and a child, and bring them to the safe houses. And each night, she'd speak with the crew, see how many people they could fit on board the next day, and one by one, in violation of the curfew, walk those people from the safe houses up to the attic, where they'd spend the night with Henny, with the 4 crew members, until the earliest hours the next morning when they could bring people on board, when the crew could get on board the boat and appear to be doing something that was part of their regular authorized routine. The crew would get on board, and Henny would bring everybody down to the first floor of the warehouse, and they'd be lined up in rows, looking out towards the channel, towards the boat, and there across a 15 or so foot cobblestone path was the best indication that many of them had days or weeks so they could get out of this alive. One last hurdle to get across, 2 German troops marched up and down the dock, crisscrossing in front of Gerda. The crew would signal to Henny when it was as good as it was going to get for one more person to come across. She would propel them towards the boat. They'd make that run across the cobblestone path. The crew would pick them up, deposit them into the cargo hold. And when everybody capable of doing that had done it, Henny would run across with the children, too young and too heavily sedated from the time they were brought to the attic to do that on their own. And then finally, hatch covers would be put over the cargo hold. As much heavy gear as possible would be put on top of that. And then in one last hurdle to overcome, the sentries would board the boat each day, go through at least a cursory inspection. Crew members, smart guys, you would be best for all around to make this as friendly encounter as possible. They'd have beers ready, and Nazi guards, the Nazi sentries would end up sitting on the edges of the cargo hold, drinking their beers, their boots so far above the heads of the refugees below, until finally they would get ashore, the dock lines could be cast off, and the boat would begin its journey to Sweden. The closest port that it utilized was 14 miles away, the longest distance for the ports that it used, 25 miles, 2 to 3.5 hours at sea in the dark of the cargo hold, until finally they could quickly be put ashore, and they were put ashore very quickly so that the boat could get on to its routine duties before it was missed, before it ran out of excuses. And this was done day after day for a month. 300 people were transported on this boat during that operation, 10 to 15 per day. Another 700 people rescued by it during the balance of the war. Danish resistance fighters, Allied airmen whose planes crashed or parachuted onto Danish soil. It was an extraordinary operation, 300 boats, thousands of mariners, tens of thousands of helpers on shore. And the results were so great, 95% of the population saved, 7,742 Jews by latest count, 650 non-Jewish loved ones who went with them as well. So successful that one might draw what would be an incorrect inference that it was easy or relatively free of danger. There are enough disasters in the early days to prove otherwise. In Gilgali, on the very first day of the operation, one boat leaving the port was fired upon. 19 Jews jumped overboard, swam ashore, and were captured. 80 people were subsequently captured in Gilgali in a church loft as people continued to stream in at the point when the Nazis had closed the harbor. And their presence.
Did you want to show us a map of also before we go on?
Yeah. So you have a map here that basically shows the area of the rescue operations. You can see where Copenhagen is. It's about 12 miles across to Sweden. It gets the gap narrows to as low as 2.5 miles up in Helsingborg. There was certainly an initial rush to the area where the distance was shortest, where it looked most promising on the map. Those areas in practice were often the most difficult. Man-made harbors, large walls, small openings to keep waves out. Also made it easy to keep boats in and to see exactly what was happening. With one such harbor between Copenhagen and Helsingborg, early on, I think the second day of the operation, 8 fishing boats managed to get out and bring Jewish refugees to Sweden. But they came back, made the mistake of returning with empty fish holds and dry nets. And that was enough to have the boats confiscated and the crews sent off to a Nazi prison where another prisoner reported on the brutal treatment. So it was a process that that involved a learning curve. They learned quickly, happily, and adapted, came up with better plans. And meanwhile, other events came to their aid. One of them being a tremendous spike in sabotage activities that diverted Nazi forces from chasing Jews to preserving their supply line. You had within those waters 1,300 fishing boats. And so for a Nazi patrol boat or other vessel, it wasn't simply a question of saying, aha, there's a boat, let's chase it, but a question of looking out at 1,300 boats and trying to figure out, ascertain which is carrying Jews and which are carrying fish. You also had an event a month before this that was tremendously helpful. It was the destruction of the Danish naval fleet by its own sailors and officers at a point where the Nazis sought to capture those boats, put them into Nazi service. The sailors and officers followed standing orders to make sure that didn't happen. Some 26 boats were sent to the bottom, depriving the Nazis of what could have been an effective blockade. So a lot of things came together to overcome what were truly significant obstacles and carry out what seemed, as I said, even to the Danes, just days before the rescue effort, something that would be an impossibility.
Well, that's an excellent recounting, Howard, and I commend your book to the entire audience. So thank you for that. And let me now turn back, if I may, to Suzannah and ask, you said it, Chana said it too, borrowing and building off of what Howard said with regard to the Danish rescue, where people went back ultimately to Denmark after, and there was no looting at all. How did you find, Suzannah, the folks who you interviewed who told about how the Shabbos table was left as it was, other than the story in Bulgaria, the wonderful movie, The Optimist, on what was done by the Bulgarian people at points? It is a remarkable tale. So how did you find those witnesses with Chana's help?
Oh yeah, and when you make a film, especially a documentary, and you start interviewing people, they tend to lead you to other people, so it becomes like a domino effect. And yes, with Chana's help, because Chana was a tour guide for 25 years to Scandinavia, so she knew people there, and so we went. One of the survivors that we went, that was in the film, we had gone to a Chabad house in Denmark, and he was one of the members, and she knew that he was one of the members there. So that's how we got to him. And then Bamberger was a good friend of hers.
Right.
So that's how we got to him. So yes, Chana helped quite a lot. And then other people, just Kate Voss, the one that was rescued by Raoul Wallenberg with the Schutzpass. She's another remarkable woman. She was rescued by Raoul Wallenberg twice, twice, and then she went back to Hungary and got caught up in the revolution over there in 1956 and had to be rescued again, not by Raoul Wallenberg, but had to get out of there. But Kate is like the biggest spokesperson around Sweden and Europe and Budapest. She's all over. She led us to Tom Lantos, Congressman Tom Lantos and Annette Lantos, because they worked together to make Raoul Wallenberg's name known to the world. And actually, Tom and Annette Lantos were responsible for making Raoul Wallenberg the second honorary U.S. citizen of the United States, second to Winston Churchill. And,
Absolutely.
yeah, and so she got, she got him his picture on a stamp. She got streets named after him. So she wanted to keep his legacy alive. And between Annette and Kate and Tom and many other people, but those were the two people that are in the film.
Absolutely, thank you. Hannah, tell us a little more about your father and your eldest brother Mendel and the role that they played during the war in helping with the rescue and dealing with the crisis.
I just want to finish up with what Suzannah was saying. We had so much fun one day. We were in Gil and I were looking around, and Suzannah says, Hannah, I want to interview a fisherman that helped with the rescues. I said, I don't know any fishermen here. And Suzannah said, you got to find one. So we started running around. But Suzannah says, you have to find, okay? So I started looking around and I asked one fisherman and another fisherman, and they led us to that house. You saw me with one fisherman that I was talking to. And we ended up going to his house and knocking on the door. And the wife came out opening the door. She says, what do you want? And I could speak her language, thank God. And I said, we're from America making a film. And that she opened the door wide and she let us in. And we started talking to her husband. But it was interesting when we were walking around in Gillelite and I was trying to get information from people. And there was a man that was following us. And I said, I don't know why he's following us. It's like he's just watching what I'm doing. And finally I went up to him and I said, is there something that you would like me to speak to you about? And he goes like this. He was part of the underground and they had been sworn to secrecy. So all these years later, they would never reveal anything that had happened in those days. It was so embedded in them not to betray any of their friends. It was just an incredible thing. And the people that we interviewed, and there were so many, many interesting people. I wrote a book about it, and it's outside on the table there. It's called It Was Evening, It Was Morning. And so if you're interested in that book, it has all these stories about the people we interviewed who survived in Sweden and we built their lives. So now to the question that you asked me. Okay, my father was a rabbi in Sweden. And during the peaceful years, it was a very peaceful time. My father came to Sweden and he thought he was going to stay there for a very short span of time. He came in 1930. He thought he would stay there until all the problems in America were resolved with the stock market crash. But then Hitler came in and doors started closing and we ended up staying there until the end of the war. So when the war ended, my father became so totally overwhelmed with what was happening because all the survivors that possibly could, and you saw that Suzannah did that in the film, the Volker Bernadotte and the white buses. Most of the people that came were women, and many of these young women, 20 years old, 21, 23, 24, they were really, really young. Many of them were in a terribly, terribly difficult situation. They were called agonot, which means actually that they were chained. And I just wrote an article about it in Ami magazine, and it was dedicated to my father. It's called The Rabbi Who Unchained the Women. They were chained because they couldn't get married again. If you're married, you cannot remarry unless you show proof that your husband had died. And these women were living widows. They had no way of proving. Hitler wasn't nice enough to issue any death certificates. So what did these women do? They came to my father and they spent hours talking to him. And then my father had to actually contact men. They had houses where they lived in Sweden. The survivors lived in these houses. And they had separate places for men and separate places for the women. So my father had to contact the men to find out which ones came from the same area as this woman's husband, and if they knew them, and get contact and get witnesses. And so for each case, it was an endless amount of work to get witnesses to come to testify that they had been in the same camp with this man, that they had seen him, that they had watched him go into the gas chambers, that they had seen him be shot. and all these things had to be done. And they were, of course, in those days, long ago, everything had to be written down by hand, and everything had to be recorded. There were no recording mechanisms, and there was no way of putting things down. And my father spent hours and hours and hours. So there I was as a child, and my father kept the room closed to his study. And of course, we couldn't really go into that room because they were there night and day and night. They would come from the houses where they lived, from the displaced persons camps, which usually were like 2-3 hours away by buses to come to New York. It was a hardship. And many times they slept over in the house. But they would sit in his room, and I could hear them crying and crying and screaming. And it was so shocking and so scary. And this would go on night and day and day and night. And I could actually see my father day by day. He was a young man. He was only 50 years old, and his black hair was turning gray. And he was so shaken by the stories they told. You have to understand that these girls had been in concentration camps, and it had been, Doris was our guide today. Doris was sitting in the audience, and she was talking about how when the people were in the camp, their fight was every day for daily survival. They couldn't think of anything beyond that. It was just a matter of getting through the day. So when they came to Sweden, that was the first time that they had an opportunity to think back on what had happened to them in the concentration camp. And they began to spill out everything that had happened to them. And it came pouring out of them and pouring out of them nonstop. And do you know, I didn't realize it then, but when they did that, people in Sweden, and of course, if they came to other places, people couldn't bear to hear what they were saying. So they would immediately change the topic and say, let me bring you a glass of tea. Let me bring you some cake. Why don't you have something to eat? To get them off from talking. They didn't realize that they needed to unburden themselves from the trauma. And if you look at the literature that was published about World War II, the first 10, 20 years, there was no literature coming out because they were quieted and they simply couldn't speak. So it took time until they had the strength to get the voice. And it seems that there's now more pouring out of second generation, more things going out after time because there was such an overwhelming situation. So this thing with the Argonaut was something that also shows the spirit of the young Jewish women. They didn't want to live in the past, and they didn't want to dwell on the horror and nightmare. They wanted to live. They wanted to get married and have families. That was the most important thing on their minds. So they were getting married already in Sweden. They were getting married. They got married in the displaced persons camp. And they had the largest percentage of children born at that time. So it was really a tribute to the spirit of the people. And you were asking about my brother. I have my oldest brother, Mendel. So he was about 20, 22 years old at the time. And he found out that he could marry girls. This was during the war. This was like in 1942, maybe 43, that girls in Holland, that if you married them and they married a Swedish citizen, you could bring them to Sweden for safety. So somehow or other, my brother married a girl without seeing her, just getting the information from the girl. And they just traded pictures, and he married a girl and he brought her to Sweden. I remember her name. The first one was Anna Orgel. And unfortunately, she had such a bad case of tuberculosis that she didn't survive for very long. But at least she lived in safety, and she died a noble death in a bed, and she had a funeral and everything else. Then my brother went and married a second girl and then a third. But by that time, the authorities realized he was getting married too many times and getting divorced too many times. So they kind of stopped the whole thing. But my brother also did something really wonderful. He felt that the displaced persons, here they came, all these survivors, and they were living in these displaced persons camps. They couldn't go to work. They were kind of like quarantined for a while, and they had to recuperate. And they didn't know the language, and they didn't know where they were going to live. Of course, they all wanted to live in Stockholm, but they couldn't because there wasn't enough quarters to live there. So they ended up sending them to small towns where many times they didn't have much of a Jewish life or anything. So that was difficult. So my brother would go and socialize in these camps. he would go to a men's camp and he would get friendly with all the young men. And then he would go to a women's camp. And then he began organizing activities, social activities for them, for lectures and all kinds of meetings that they could have. My brother eventually ended up marrying one of the girls that had come from Hungary. And then she introduced her friend to my other brother. So they both got married to survivor girls in Sweden. So that was like really kind of exciting.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let me do a follow-up with Howard on one question on the Danes and then get into a little about Raoul Wallenberg with the limited time we have left. Howard, you know, when we talked earlier before the program, you talked a little about the lessons about life and how it was affected in Denmark. You want to speak to that a little more here, briefly?
Yeah, I think it's important to look at not simply the maritime rescue, that month-long operation, but the 3.5 years before that, when Jews were insulated within Denmark from all forms of Nazi persecution, and the aftermath. What the Jewish rescue did for Denmark as a whole, and what it did to the Nazis. It was remarkable that a nation bordered by nothing other than Germany, so close to the heart of the beast, was able to stop persecution at the border, even though it couldn't stop tanks and infantry and everything else from coming across. And a couple of the things that are key was a realization that if you want to get to this horrible end, you have to stop it at the beginning, that you can't allow incrementalism to take hold. And so at every point where there was pressure to isolate the Jews, the response was a showing of solidarity, something that created the atmosphere or perpetuated an atmosphere that already existed, that then led to a point where on hours of notice, the whole population was ready to jump into action when the rescue, the evacuation became necessary.
Thank you.
The aftermath of that is that while some who participated in the rescue went back to normal lives, others found that impossible. And one of the groups that found it impossible was the Goethe rescue group. They progressed directly into armed resistance on a magnificent scale. Henny, these college students who she bonded with, for 4 months following the rescue, blew up 22 major industrial sites that had been converted to making war equipment for the Nazis. One of their raids making the pages of the New York Times in the midst of World War II. And what happened to the Nazis was the nightmare that so many had predicted if they had taken action against the Jews. This nationwide revolt, as people found out what they had within themselves, the courage they perhaps didn't know they possessed, as they formed with other people who they found could be trusted, relied upon, and as they experienced exhilaration of finally taking action against evil rather than trying to coexist with it. All of those things produced a situation where they couldn't simply go back, where this period, sometimes referred to as one of cooperation, I think more properly icy coexistence, came crashing down. And whatever gains the Nazis had made by invading Denmark were lost to it. And Denmark put itself in a situation where it was able to emerge from the war in far greater standing with the rest of the world, and for the Danes themselves, emerged from the war with something of a sense of pride rather than shame. Pride that came at a great price in terms of lives lost during that latter period. But in every case of anybody I've ever encountered, felt that price was well worth it. And they did the only thing that could have been done under the circumstances, and yet so different from.
Thank you. No, the Danish story is really a remarkable tale. So let's turn a little, Suzannah and Hannah, to Raoul Wallenberg. As you said, Suzannah, he was an honorary citizen of the United States, but at least 5 other countries that I'm aware of: the United Kingdom, Israel, Canada, Hungary, and Australia. And living potentially, although as the film indicates, we don't know, potentially based on some reports, as late as into the 1970s. But speak a little more, if you could, Suzannah, and also Hannah, about the background of this man. Hannah, you said he used his heart more than his head. And I'd like to delve into a little more how he helped avoid the blowing up of the ghetto in Budapest, which in the end saved so many of the lives that he is recounted for saving.
You know, people don't really know, but one of his, he was very proud of the fact that he claimed to be 160% Jewish, as according to Hitler's theory of, you know, grandparents and great grandparents and all that. But his mother's great grandfather, two great, had his name was Benedict, and he came into Sweden. He actually baptized, because that's what people did in those days if they wanted to be assimilated and they wanted to be accepted. But he was very proud of the fact, and he would talk about that. He absolutely was totally a humanitarian. There was no question about it. And he went into the situation, like you would see pictures of him and all kinds of photographs. And he usually used to wear a long coat, and he had big pockets in it. And he would have the safety passes in the pockets. And he would have his hands behind his back. And he would call out names randomly. And just, he would call out some names, and then people would understand something was going on. And they would say, do you have a safety pass for? And they would say their name. And he would say, sure, sure. And while the Germans were patrolling on the platform, he would fill in the names on the safety passes. And he wasn't even afraid. He was just like going ahead and doing it. And he was doing things beyond what you think he would have done, because he was just totally putting his whole heart into it. And he wasn't thinking, he wasn't fearful. Yes.
Here's a little backstory on Raoul Wallenberg that I didn't put in the film. You could make a whole documentary about him. So his grandfather, you know, started to take care of him in a way, in a sense of, you know, making sure he went to the right schools. He went to the University of Michigan. He came to the United States. He would hitchhike around, and he told his grandfather in a letter, you know, I'm learning a lot of negotiation skills from just hitchhiking around. And so, and another thing that the idea that he got to put the Swedish flags on the buildings, it was from Ottawa, Canada. The Queen of Holland was having her baby in a hospital in Ottawa, Canada. So, but the baby had to be Dutch. She couldn't be like a Canadian born. So they just like relegated this one part of the hospital. This is the Dutch part of the hospital, so that this way her child could be a Dutch citizen. And that's how he got the idea of putting the Swedish flag on, you know, on top of the building. So, and he had a lot of people working for him. He would bribe people, he would bribe Nazis, he would bribe policemen, and he always had informants. So he was always one step ahead of the Nazis. But you know, they were getting on to him. So he always had to switch gears and try to figure something else out. So he couldn't be staying in one place. He was moving around to different places. So that's a little bit, you know, the backstory behind Raoul. Other than
I was just touched by the fact that it was so sad. His mother was absolutely a beautiful young woman, socialite family, very well-to-do family. She got married, she must have been like 20 years old, and her husband was in the army, and he was, of course, important and had a beautiful uniform and everything else, and he was from the Wallenberg family. And when the mother got pregnant very quickly, and before he even had a chance to have the baby, before even she'd been married a year, her husband died of cancer. So when he was born, she was a widow already. And so, yeah, the mother had a very strong attachment to him. And when he disappeared and they put him into the jail in Russia, she kept writing letters constantly and consistently. And they had a book that was about this thick and about this big, all about the search that they made to find him, because she spent the entire life doing it. what I understand is that she and her second husband, they both died. They both committed suicide, and she spent all of her life looking for putting all her effort into finding him because she got married again to Van Dardel, and she had daughter Nina Lagergren, and she had a son. But Raoul was he was so important in her life that it was just sad, and I always thought of that.
And then Nina, the sister of Raoul Wallenberg that you saw in the film, so she took up the cause also with her mother. But, you know, when she finally figured this is hopeless, but now we got to keep Raoul's legacy alive, she started the Raoul Wallenberg School, and she just wanted people to learn how to be courageous and kind and care for, you know, another human being, and became a whole human rights organization. And Nina and her brother started not seeing eye to eye, and it seemed like he just wanted her to just give up with the whole Raoul Wallenberg thing after a while, and she wouldn't. And I guess they never talked again, her and her brother. But with the investigation, we interviewed the diplomats, and they had this like 10-year investigation. What happened to Raoul Wallenberg? And it was a collaboration between the Swedes and the Russians. The Russians, you know, first they said, oh, there's no, you know, we don't have Raoul Wallenberg here, but they got caught in their lies. So then they started to say Raoul Wallenberg died of a heart attack in 1947. There are accounts of witnesses in these jails and prisons that saw Raoul Wallenberg after 1947, but you can't be sure that's not documented. But another way the Russians say, oh, he died of a heart attack is like code speak that they pretty much executed him, supposedly. But
I just want to add though that Raoul Wallenberg was such a big hero. And when I started doing my tours in Scandinavia in 1980, and I used to get the people together and talk about what happened, usually on Shabbos afternoon, I would get them together. And the Swedish guys that I had during the week would ask if they could come and just participate. They didn't know who he was. They didn't learn about him in school. They didn't hear about him. And they were astounded at the enthusiasm I had in speaking about what he had done for the Jewish people. And it was really, really shocking because Sweden was afraid to antagonize Russia because Russia is so big, you look on the map, and Sweden is so small. They didn't want to antagonize Russia and make a big deal about the fact that he had disappeared. So his presence and his life and his importance was kept
I understand.
Number of years.
Hannah, absolutely. I'm getting a message that we have to close this up in a moment. Let me just say, I certainly hope that the story of what befell him will finally be answered one day, his bold, audacious, and courageous actions. Let me simply end on a note of simply saying, you know, we need more upstanders like Raoul Wallenberg, like the Danish people, like those in Norway and with the white buses who did this, who spoke up and dared, as I said earlier, to do what was right. So let me turn it back to Leah to close the program. There's much more I would have liked to go into, but time doesn't permit. So thank you one and all, and thank the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for such a fantastic film and a really fascinating discussion. So thank you to our incredible panelists tonight. And thank you to all of you who have come out or who have tuned in virtually. I just want to remind you that we have a couple of really special programs coming up in the next 2 weeks. So a week from tonight, we have the opening of our brand new exhibition here at the museum, our virtual reality experience. And then the week after that, on the 27th, we have our International Holocaust Day Remembrance Commemoration with Saul and Ruby's Holocaust Survivor Band. So please go to our website and register for these programs and check out all the other exciting offerings that we have here at the museum. So thank you again to everyone, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Could I just say something? No. Could I just say something? I just want to say thank you to all of you that came here tonight. I want to say thank you to Rahim for being so cooperative and wonderful and putting this together. I want to thank Doris for the wonderful tour today. And I want to thank Suzannah for listening to me and making the video. And I want to thank Howard for all the important information that we had.